For seam samples 5 and 6, you're going to start out each of them with 2 3x6" rectangles that you lay right sides together and just place a couple pins in to keep the right edge lined up straight. And we are going to be sewing a 1/4" seam for both of these, so both of them will be sewn in the same manner. What you are looking at on your presser foot here is if you have your machine on a 1 on the stitch selector, then to do a 1/4" seam, you will put the edge of the fabric even with this line right here. So that is 1/4" or 2/8 inch away from the needle. Often what I do is I turn the needle to a center position, so I turn it to a 2 on the stitch selector. And if you do that and keep the edge of the fabric just inside the edge of the presser foot, then you can also get a 1/4" seam with that as well. So we'll go ahead now and sew a 1/4" seam down the long 6" side of the fabric. So you're going to take your seam gauge and lay it on top of the seam you just sewed, and you're going to look for that second little notch or the second little guideline on your ruler on your seam gauge to make sure that you are even with that. Okay. One quick reminder: this little circle or this hole that's cut into the seam gauge, that has a little line above it that is 1/8 inch. So that's 1/8 and then 1/4 inch. Okay. If your seam is not 1/4 inch, you need to redo this or ask for help so that you can make sure you know exactly where to look. For sample 5, you are to take your seam, so we just did our 1/4 inch seam. You will take it and open it at the iron, and you are going to press the seam open. This is something that you do a lot in quilting, but we also do it in other projects. So if you ever see in the instructions that it says complete a seam and then press it open, this is what it means. Okay. One thing that you want to do after you have pressed the seam open is you want to flip it over to the front side and make sure there is no creasing along the seam. What that means is that none of this got folded over into it. Okay, so it lays perfectly flat on the outside, and then on the inside that seam is pressed open. The only thing I need to do before attaching this to my grading sheet is I need to go ahead and trim off this extra thread. For seam sample 6, you're going to complete that same step that you did with seam sample 5. So you have 2 3x6" rectangles lined up. You'll stitch in a 1/4 inch seam. The next thing you need to do is come to the iron, and you're going to take that sample and you're going to press it to one side. This is also something that you would see quite often in quilting. So I'm going to open up the 2 sides, and then I'm just going to lay the fabric over on one side. If you were quilting or if you were making this for a project, unless the project tells you to go to the right or to the left, what you would do is you would press to the darker side. So let's say I had like a white fabric on one side and a gray fabric on the other. I'm going to press my seam toward the gray side. That's the darker side, and that would just eliminate you being able to see the seam allowance through the fabric. Okay, so this now is ready to go ahead and secure in the project or sample 6.